Okay. So as we continue our journey through the Jewish year, the journey isn't just about talking about holidays that come up or anything else related to the calendar, but it is also other Jewish concepts and ideas that come up as well, sometimes related to that week's Torah portion. And so even though I'll have Torah study this week in which we'll focus on the Torah portion itself, I did want to spend some time today talking about the Ten Commandments, because this week's Torah portion includes the Ten Commandments in the portion Yitro, Jethro in English. And like I said, we'll talk more about the content of the Ten Commandments next time, but we all know what the Ten Commandments are. And I just want to say, spend some time talking about the place of the Ten Commandments in Jewish tradition and in our liturgy. And also it's related to the holidays. So even though it's something from this week's Torah portion, the Ten Commandments themselves serve as a central element of what it means to be Jewish, and that's part of our journey through the Jewish year. So the Ten Commandments, we're told in the book of Exodus that the people got to Mount Sinai in the third month after the Exodus from Egypt. So the third month, the first month is the month, according to the Torah, the first month is the month of Nisan. We alluded to this a couple of weeks ago. So the first month is the month of Passover, which is the month of Nisan. And the second month in today's calendar is the month of Iyar. And the third month is the month of Sivan. Okay. And on the third day of the month, they had to get ready to receive God's revelation at Mount Sinai. And on the sixth day of the month, that's when the revelation occurred. And so from then on, we celebrate the holiday of Shavuot, which in English is the Feast of Weeks. And when we get there, we'll talk more about the holiday of Shavuot. But the historical event that relates to that holiday is the Ten Commandments, and by extension, the revelation of the entire Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai. Because the date is given in this week's portion as the third month and the sixth day of the month when the revelation occurred, then from then on, the 6th of Sivan is the holiday of Shavuot. And on the holiday of Shavuot, on the first day of the holiday, there's only one day of Shavuot in Israel. There are 2 days of Shavuot outside of Israel. On the first day of Shavuot, we read that section from the book of Exodus that includes the Ten Commandments as the Torah reading for the holiday of Shavuot. So within the liturgical calendar, we read the Ten Commandments as part of the holiday of Shavuot. We also read the Ten Commandments in this week's portion when we get to it in order of reading the Torah throughout the entire year. It's in the portion Jethro, which is read this week, and a reiteration of the Ten Commandments occurs in the book of Deuteronomy, in the second portion of Deuteronomy, the portion Va'etchanan. And when we get there in the summertime, sometime in August usually, that's when we read the Ten Commandments again. So 3 times a year, we read the Ten Commandments as part of the Torah reading cycle, either for Shabbat or for the holiday of Shavuot. But there are other phrases or sections of the Torah that are incorporated into the prayer book. And the question that rabbis have is why the Ten Commandments is not read in the liturgy. Why do we have the Shema and its accompanying paragraphs that we read twice a day, morning and evening. In those services, we read Shema and the V'ahavta paragraph and two other paragraphs in the Torah, which are considered part of a unit of Shema and its blessings. Why do we have the Song of the Sea, which we read in last Shabbat's Torah reading, the song that Moses and the people of Israel sang after the miracle of crossing the sea? Why is that included in the preliminary service every single morning? And why not the Ten Commandments? Why shouldn't they be included in the liturgy? So there's an article. I commend you to, there are lots of books to have on your shelf that are great reference books for understanding the Jewish calendar, understanding Jewish concepts. And you can email me privately and I can recommend some books to you. But there's a great website called My Jewish Learning. If you write that all as one word, My Jewish Learning, with no dots and no spaces between them, myjewishlearning.com, you'll find a treasure trove of information about anything and everything you want to know about being Jewish. And the people who write these articles span the spectrum of the Jewish community. From all denominations. So that makes it a very attractive website. So it's not, it's not associated with any one movement in Judaism. It can be a great learning tool for all Jews, just as a quick reference guide. So there's an article there by my teacher from rabbinical school days, Rabbi David Galinkin, who is the president of the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem, an affiliate of the Jewish Theological Seminary, or maybe officially it's not affiliated anymore, but it's part of the conservative movement. And he wrote an article, Whatever Happened to the Ten Commandments? So I want to highlight a couple of things from that article that will help us understand what the place of the Ten Commandments, why it's not in the liturgy, and why we only have a connection to it in the calendar when we read it on Shabbat in the Torah reading cycle or on the holiday of Shavuot. Now, the Ten Commandments, as I said, with the Shema and the Song of the Sea, these are sections of praise of God or an acknowledgement of the one and only God. And it would make sense to have these sections in the liturgy. When we are praying to God, it makes sense to affirm that we believe in the one and only God. So it makes sense to have the Shema in the liturgy at least twice a day. It makes sense to affirm, as the V'ahavta paragraph does, and the middle paragraph, V'haya im Shamoa, and the third paragraph, the Vayomer paragraph, talking about the tzitzit. It makes sense to affirm our commitment to the covenant, to our gratitude to the Torah, and our commitment to a life of fulfilling the commandments, as those three paragraphs talk about. It also makes sense to refer to the Song of the Sea, what seems from the Torah to be a spontaneous burst of gratitude and song for an event that occurred on behalf of the entire community of Israel. That spontaneous song, which expresses gratitude to God and wonder at God's might and power, makes sense to have that in the liturgy at least once a day, as it is in the morning service. And it also makes sense to have other paragraphs and sections from the book of Psalms, especially, which those 150 Psalms in the Bible discuss personal feelings and communal feelings about our relationship with God. But you would think that the Ten Commandments, which serves as an essential foundational element of Jewish law, that these are 10 statements that highlight for us what it means to be a religious person, that we acknowledge, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Don't have any other gods before me. Um, don't bear false witness, Shabbat, respect of parents, do not murder, commit adultery, steal, etc. These are essential foundational principles on which a society is built. And it's not just Jewish society, you could say global society. Most religions in the world have, whether they are Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, or even some elements of Far Eastern religions have principles that are very similar. Well, Muslims and Christians have these very same 10 commandments. Other religions have principles very similar to these. They serve as an essential foundation on which the entire religion and religious society is built. So why aren't the 10 commandments then in the prayer book? So Galinkin points out that the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is the first body of literature written by the rabbis and edited 1,800 years ago. So I will continue to refer to the rabbis, and I will refer to the Mishnah and the Talmud very often, almost in every single one of these sessions every week. And I just want to reiterate the message of who these rabbis are, because Judaism today is based on the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud. So the rabbis of 1,800 years ago edited their teachings of the Torah and the Bible that became their interpretations, which became the Judaism that we know it today. While the temple was standing in Jerusalem, officially, Judaism was really Israelite religion. It wasn't Judaism until the rabbis created it. So Israelite religion, as the Torah describes, is bringing sacrifices and other offerings to the temple in Jerusalem at specific times of year for the holidays or Shabbat, or for particular moments in one's life as a sin offering, a gratitude, peace offering, things like that. So Israelite religion was temple in Jerusalem based and sacrifice based. The rabbis made Israelite religion portable into the Judaism that we know it today. So our Judaism is not based on the temple in Jerusalem. We pray towards Israel, and if you're in Israel, you pray towards Jerusalem, and if you're in Jerusalem, you pray towards the Temple Mount. So we are land of Israel oriented, but our religion is not based on the temple in Jerusalem anymore. We, instead of offering sacrifices, obviously, we pray and we observe commandments and rituals and practices and customs, all designed, interpreted, and created by the rabbis as edited in the Mishnah first, 1,800 years ago, and then in the Gemara, which becomes the Talmud, Mishnah and Gemara together, edited 1,500 years ago. Okay, so in the Mishnah, we have a statement that tells us that what was recited in the earliest of services as prayers to God. And it says in the Mishnah that the priests in the temple used to recite every morning the 10 commandments, the Shema, and with the V'ahavta paragraph, and the second paragraph, V'haya im Shemoah, and the blessing that's after the Shema, and the Amida, and the priestly blessing. That was, according to the Mishnah, what the order of prayers were in the temple as the sacrifices were being offered. So we have a source from the rabbis that the 10 commandments were recited every day. There's another source that suggests that the Ten Commandments, that section, was also included in the tefillin that we wear. So these leather straps that we wear during the week, not on Shabbat or holidays, which have a box and a strap that we wrap around our arm, and a box and straps that go between our eyes on our head. In that box, I'm just taking out my tefillin now, and I have it right here. So in this box, so this is the box with the straps around it. This is the one for the hand. Inside this box is one long parchment, very thin and narrow. Parchment has 4 sections from the Torah on it that talk about the commandment to wear tefillin. Okay, but apparently in older tefillin from the time of the rabbis, there used to be also the paragraph of the 10 Commandments in the tefillin. And that changed only in the time of the rabbis. So before the time of the rabbis, that we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the community of Jews that lived in the Dead Sea area, north of Masada, south of Jericho. There was a community called, a town called Qumran that had a community of ascetics and that were Jewish. And apparently in their tefillin, they had the 10 Commandments included. And also there were other sources that suggest that in some Jewish communities, either in Babylonia or in Egypt, that the 10 Commandments were included in the morning service. The question then is, why didn't it stay in the morning service? And the subsequent generations of rabbis say, because of heretics, the 10 Commandments was taken out of the service. Now, which is an unusual statement. What do heretics have to do with determining what we pray every day? But the idea there is heretics, there were, let me say it this way. As the prayer book was developing and as rabbinic Judaism was taking hold as the form of Judaism that would be observed by all Jews, not just in Israel, but in Babylonia and in other places around the world, the rabbis were in slight competition with other Jews who did not accept the authority of the rabbis. So these so-called heretics, because they disagreed with the rabbis, were not necessarily heretics. They just had a different opinion about how to be Jewish or how to observe Jewish culture without the temple in Jerusalem. Among these heretics were the early followers of Jesus. Jesus, as we know, was Jewish. His disciples were Jewish, and the followers of his, mainly in northern Israel in the Galilee and the communities along the shore of Lake Kinneret, were all Jewish. He just had a different opinion, more progressive, more liberal than the average rabbinic interpretation of the Torah. So what we find in the Christian Bible of statements of Jesus in sermons that he gave, you just look at the book of Matthew, for example, with the Sermon on the Mount, that statements there, they could be Jewish statements. There's nothing particularly Christian in the Sermon on the Mount that and they're just general principles of love and justice, etc. So what Jesus was preaching and teaching was very similar to what the rabbis were teaching. However, his followers transformed his teachings into a new religion by claiming that Jesus was the Messiah. And the fact that they claimed that Jesus was the Messiah, for the rabbis, that meant that they were taking themselves out of the Jewish community. There's a red line beyond which you can't go and still be included in the Jewish community. And one of those red lines is that we believe in the coming of the Messiah. We don't believe that the Messiah has come already. So the followers of Jesus who were Jewish, who claimed that Jesus was the Messiah, let alone claim that he was the Son of God, automatically place themselves outside of the orbit and the boundary of the Jewish community. And within the Jewish community, the rabbis call those outside heretics. And it's possible that, the followers of Jesus who said that you no longer need to follow halakha, Jewish law, in order to be a follower of Jesus, right? Subsequent generations after Jesus said you don't need to follow Jewish law in order to be Jewish, even though the original followers of Jesus did follow Jewish law. Once they claim that, that also makes them out of the boundary of the Jewish community. And so if we have the 10 commandments in the prayer book, heretics like the followers of Jesus could claim all you need is the 10 commandments in order to be a good religious person. The fact that it's in the prayer book proves that it's important, and it's the only section that needs to be highlighted from the entire Torah, only section of Jewish law from the Torah that's in the prayer book. Therefore, it proves, the heretics might say, that all you need to do to be a good religious person is follow the 10 commandments. You don't need the 603 other commandments that make life into a legalistic kind of life. And so to avoid the possible claim of these so-called heretics that the 10 commandments is all you need to lead a just and religious life, the 10 commandments were taken out of the prayer book. So it seems kind of funny then that we would have to worry about what the heretics say in order to maintain our sense of what it means to be Jewish. You could say the same thing about the Shema. Maybe the only principle we need to know in Judaism is the Shema, that there is only one God. There are plenty of other principles that we need to know, like when we sing the song Yigdal on Friday night, that has 13 basic precepts in there that what it means to be Jewish. One of them is the belief in the one and only God. So you could argue that that's the only precept because the Shema is in the liturgy. So it seems kind of an unusual kind of argument, but that argument took hold as a popular opinion. And so therefore, we don't find the 10 commandments in our prayer books anymore. There are other non-traditional prayer books that do have the 10 commandments in them, like some editions of the Reform prayer book. And in some traditional prayer books, after the morning service, at the very end of the morning service, after the last Kaddish, after the Psalm for the day, there are some sections that are there to study. And in some of these traditional prayer books, the 10 Commandments is found there. So you won't find them in our prayer book, right? If you happen to have the weekday prayer book and go to the end of the morning service, you have what happens after all the Psalms is the supplements for special occasions during the week, like so at the end of, you have Adon Olam and Yigdal on pages 101 and 102 in the weekday Sim Shalom, and then you have Musaf if it's Rosh Chodesh or intermediate days of the holiday, and then the processions with the lulav and etrog on Sukkot, and then it goes to Mincha. to the afternoon service. So you'd have to look at an Orthodox prayer book really to see a couple of other sections there that are for study. There's a section of Anima Amin, uh, statements of belief that are that's there to study, and in some of them there's the Ten Commandments there. So so for that, then the unusual reason why the Ten Commandments are not found in the prayer book, because we're worried that not only the heretics, I think then perhaps the rabbis are thinking that maybe the average Jew, perhaps for the rabbis, a Jew who is not so educated might think that all we need to do to be a good Jew is to follow the Ten Commandments, and to and in order to avoid that temptation to think that all we need to do is follow the Ten Commandments, the rabbis took it out of the prayer book. The other thing I wanted to say, unless there are anybody have a question or comment about the placement of the Ten Commandments in the prayer book, any questions or comments, you can write it in the chat. You could just unmute yourself and ask if you have anything. So the other thing I wanted to say about the Ten Commandments is gets to another sense of a Jewish concept, not just about the placement of things in the prayer book, but also just the place of how we understand what happened at Mount Sinai. As was it a historical event? Was it a religious event? What happened at Mount Sinai? So just to remind ourselves that it says in the Torah that on the third month, in the third month, on the sixth day after coming out of Egypt, the people experienced the revelation of God at Mount Sinai. So it's described in this week's portion, the shofar, the thunder and lightning, and God's voice as the people of Israel heard it. So this event that occurred at Mount Sinai is a central religious event for the rabbis and a central religious event for all Jewish people. The understanding is that whether we were born Jewish or whether we converted to Judaism, we were all at Mount Sinai, that we were all there. It's based on a word that's in this week's portion, Bayom Hazeh. So in the third month, on the third day, when the people were gathered around the mountain, it says in the Torah, Bayom Hazeh, which is unusual for the Torah to describe something that happened. It should have said Bayom Hahu, on that day. But because it says Bayom Hazeh, on this day, meaning giving the impression it's happening now, it leads to the Midrash, the rabbinic interpretation, that the event at Mount Sinai was not a historical event alone, but it's an ongoing spiritual event, that we have to try to relive that moment every day of our lives when we're doing Jewish, so that it's as if we're at Mount Sinai, as if we're hearing God's voice, motivating us and inspiring us to continue to be Jewish. So that's the centrality of the Mount Sinai experience in Jewish life. So it's not just the Ten Commandments that were heard at that moment, but it's also the experience of being at the mountain. And in fact, from chapter 18 of Exodus through the end of the book of Leviticus, that whole section, from chapter 18 of Exodus all the way through the end of the book of Leviticus, the next book of the Torah, everything there happened at Mount Sinai. The people only started moving away from Mount Sinai in the book of Numbers, the fourth book of the Torah. So from the middle of the second book of the Torah through the end of the third book of the Torah, at all, whatever is written there was based on the people still being at Mount Sinai. They only started moving away in the book of Numbers, which quickly describes 40 years of wandering in the entire book of Numbers. And then the entire book of Deuteronomy takes place as the people are ready to enter the land of Israel. So they're at one place in Deuteronomy, they're marching for 40 years in the book of Numbers, and half of Exodus and all of Leviticus, they're at Mount Sinai. So the majority of the events that happen for the people of Israel happen, and the laws that are presented to the people that are in the Torah all occur at Mount Sinai. So you'd think it's a central element that should be recorded for posterity as an important place, an important landmark for Jewish tradition. So you would think then that it is a historical event, that there was a Mount Sinai, and that the events that are described in the Torah that happened there actually happened. But it's fascinating that there are two sections I want to point out, one from the Torah, one from the book of Psalms, that might question or lead us to question whether Mount Sinai happened or not. So one is later in the book of Deuteronomy, which mostly is about recounting some of the laws that the people are supposed to observe once they get into the land of Israel. And there are some new laws that are presented as well. So in the portion Ki Tavo, there in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26, it describes this of what are the people of Israel supposed to do when they bring the first fruits to the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary, and later to the temple in Jerusalem. There's a formula they're supposed to recite with the help of the Kohen, kind of a brief history lesson that they are supposed to repeat. It's a mantra that is supposed to repeat. It happens, by the way, to be in the Haggadah, in that section in the Haggadah known as Magid. There's a long midrash interpretation of a section of the Torah. And that section of Torah is right here in the book of Deuteronomy from the portion Ki Tavo, that paragraph that the people are supposed to recite as they bring the first fruits to the altar in the temple in Jerusalem. And it says, "You shall then recite as follows before the Lord your God. My father was a fugitive Aramean, Arami Oved Avi. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, an awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, O Lord, have given me." What about stopping at Mount Sinai first to hear the commandment to bring the first fruits? Sure, understand the history. We started in wandering Aramean. We ended up in Egypt. We became slaves in Egypt. God brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, with signs and wonders. Sure, we all know that. But what about Mount Sinai and giving the Torah and understanding the law to have to actually bring these first fruits to the sanctuary? It's fascinating that Mount Sinai isn't listed here. And another point is that in the preliminary service on Shabbat and holidays, we read Psalm 136. And Psalm 136 happens to be in the Haggadah also. And it's known as the Great Hallel, because every line in Psalm 136 ends with Ki leolam chasto, God's love endures forever, as translated in the Shabbat Sim Shalom. So you have a number of phrases here that all of the phrases highlights things that God has done on behalf of the people. So praise God For God is good, God's love endures forever. Praise God, who is almighty, the supreme sovereign, who works great wonders alone, making the heavens with wisdom, suspending earth over water, made the great lights, the sun to rule by day, the moon and stars by night. Okay, so talking about creation, Genesis chapter 1. For Genesis chapter 1, God, ki leolam chasto, God's love endures forever. God smote the Egyptian firstborn. So you're going from Genesis to Egypt, skipping Noah, Abraham and Sarah, and all of that. So going from Genesis to Egypt, God smote the Egyptian firstborn, brought Israel out of their midst with strong hand and outstretched arm. God split the sea and brought Israel through while sweeping Pharaoh and his troops into the sea. Okay? God led his people in the wilderness, smiting great kings, slaying the mighty Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of the Bashan. Okay, but what about the great wonder? You go from splitting the sea, which is last week's portion at Exodus chapter 13, to Numbers, the book of Numbers, later in the book of Numbers, where they have these battles with the kingdoms of Sihon and Bashan, or with the kingdoms of the Amorites and Bashan. What about Mount Sinai in between? And God gave their land as a heritage to his servant Israel, remembering us when we were low, rescuing us from our oppressors. So it's just fascinating to me. Exodus of Egypt serves in the liturgy as a hallmark. We say it in the Kiddush every Friday night. We say it obviously related to the holiday of Passover. It's in the service morning and evening, right before the Amidah. And one of the prayers before the Amidah, we highlight the Exodus from Egypt, past redemption, being reminded of that with a hope and prayer for future redemption and the coming of the Messiah. So we have Exodus from Egypt as a central role in our prayer book. And we have the creation of the universe and the creation of the world as a central role in the prayer book too. We have it in the preliminary service. We have that in the Kiddush as well. So at Kiddush on Friday night, we remember God creating the universe and also the Exodus from Egypt. But we don't recall Mount Sinai except on Shavuot mainly, and other possible references in the prayer book too. So what is it then about Mount Sinai? And it leads some scholars to ask in a dramatic, possibly heretical way. Jewish scholars have asked the question whether Mount Sinai even happened. And so that becomes a question whether we can even dare to ask such a question, whether Mount Sinai happened or not, which I do want to spend a moment or two on to say that it's not heresy to question whether Mount Sinai happened or not, because it's similar to asking whether Abraham and Sarah existed, whether Moses existed, whether any of the figures talked about in the Torah existed or not. We have some evidence that King David existed, so that the kings of Israel could actually be actual historical figures. But anybody before King David that's listed in the Bible, there's a question. We don't have corroborating evidence of that. We have no evidence in the entire Sinai Peninsula of 600,000 people marching through. So it begs the question, not just whether Mount Sinai happened, as to whether the Exodus happened. And it's a question, a legitimate question, whether we need to believe in the events that are described in the Torah as actual historical events in order to be a good Jew. And I would argue that we don't need to believe that these events actually took place. What we do need to believe is that the Torah itself was at least divinely inspired. That we believe that the events that are described in the Torah could have taken place, and that the perspective of the people who wrote these events down into the Torah as we have it, describing the events and the laws themselves, that we have to believe that those events and the perspective of those events and the laws themselves are divinely inspired. So whether Mount Sinai actually happened on a particular date 3,000 or so years ago doesn't matter. What matters is that what's described was spiritual. The people perceived that something like that happened, and because something like that happened, it has been carried down in our tradition. So we don't. So the point I'm making is we don't need to believe that that the Exodus occurred exactly 3,000 something years ago, and you look to that date and understand that particular history. We don't need to believe, as the ultra-Orthodox do, that the world was created 5,781 years ago, because we know that the world is much older than 5,781 years. And you don't need to believe that only what's listed in the Torah was actually created by God, so that some ultra-Orthodox Jews don't actually believe that there were dinosaurs, or evolution may have happened according to science, but rather the Torah is science. We don't need to believe that. The Torah is not meant to be a history book. The Torah is meant to be a guide to religious life. And so what we have, what looks like history being explained, is really a matter of a perspective, a religious and spiritual perspective on events, which is very different than writing a history book. So all of us, when we see things happen in our lives and see things happen around us, we have an impression that that event makes on us. And we can explain that impression, whether very clearly, unambiguously, kind of like as an eyewitness account, or we can say it was a remarkable emotional event. I was emotionally affected by this, either positively or negatively, or it was a religious, spiritual event, like a birth of a child can be explained medically and biologically, but depending on the circumstances of the birth of a child, it can be wonderful, if not miraculous. So it's all a matter of perspective. Experiencing the death of a loved one can be explained scientifically based on the causes of death, but it can also be, depending upon the nature of the death, it can be an emotionally traumatic event, and it could be a religiously transformative event, either positively or negatively. It all depends on how we respond to that particular event. And so what I'm suggesting is that Mount Sinai, as described in the Torah, is described in that emotional and spiritual kind of way, not necessarily providing us an actual historical scientific account of what happened at Mount Sinai, but rather an emotional, spiritual reaction to something that occurred that most of the people experienced. So that most people within the conservative movement, most rabbis in the conservative movement, ascribe to that particular approach that I'm suggesting. And obviously, I did not create that approach myself. It's based on teachers of mine from the rabbinical school and other modern Jewish thinkers as well. Any thoughts or comments or questions about this? So, folks, that's our journey as it continues through the Jewish year, with looking at the 10 Commandments because of this week's portion. We will start next week looking at starting to talk about Purim, because not this coming Shabbat, but this coming Shabbat, we actually say the prayer to announce the new month. Next Monday is the new month of Adar, which means we're 2 weeks from then until Purim. So we'll start talking about Purim and start talking about Passover after that as well. So I hope everybody has a good rest of the day. Please stay safe and healthy. And I'm looking out my window right now and it looks like it's snowing again, but I don't think it's sticking. So stay safe and healthy, everyone.
Right. Yasher koach.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.